Hi everyone and welcome to a new video on the CBI channel. In this tutorial series we are deploying a Django and React application on Microsoft Azure. This is not the first video in this series. We've already done 3 before. In the first one I explained the architecture of this deployment, the prerequisites and also the application that we'll be deploying. In the second video we made changes to our Django backend code so it was ready for the deployment on Microsoft Azure. And in the previous video, we have pushed our code to GitHub using Git. In the next videos, we're going to deploy our front end, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about troubleshooting and also about the cost of this deployment. But first, we need to deploy our Django backend to Microsoft Azure. And when we take a look at the architecture of this deployment, it is actually a little bit between the bottom left of the overview and the top right, because we're going to connect our GitHub code to the backend services on the Azure portal. And the deployment of this application will happen in 7 main steps. We're going to start by creating a resource group, which will function as a container for all of the different services. Next, we will be creating all of the different Azure resources that we will be needing to deploy our Django backend. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an explanation of what each of those resources actually does. Next, we're going to be creating an environment variable, and which is very important for the deployment of our application. And then we're going to connect our code to the Azure resources. As the final 2 steps, we will be modifying the YAML file that we get from Azure slightly, so our deployment can be completed. And after that is all done and complete, we're going to be adding a post-build script for database migrations in the future.
And as already explained in the architecture video, you will need an Azure account to follow along with this video. Through this link on the Microsoft website, you're able to create a free account, which will give you 55 free services and $200 of credits in your first 30 days. And you can use that to follow along with this tutorial without spending any money. However, to create your Azure account, you will need to provide your credit card details. And as always, also always make sure to stop your services after you are done with them to avoid any costing. So please go to this link and create a new Azure account if you don't have one already. If you do, please log in to portal.azure.com with your credentials, and then you will end up on this page. And the Microsoft Azure dashboard will show you the Azure services that are available, also your recent resources or your favorite ones, and will help you navigate through this portal. And if we take a look at our architecture, the first resource that we need to create on the Azure portal is a resource group, because the resource group is going to function as the container for all of the services we need to deploy our backend and our front end. What you can do is on the Azure services, you can click on resource groups right here, or you can just look for services on the top and click on resource groups to get there. And over at the resource groups, I'm going to click on create to create a new resource group for us. In the subscription, you always select your subscription. Well, I only have one, so that's very convenient. And then you can provide the resource group name. And in this instance, I'm going to call it Django Azure Web App, like this. And for the region, you always want to select the region that is closest to you, because that's going to give you the best performance. So in this case, for me, that is going to be West Europe. And once you've filled in these details, we can click on review and create. And it has passed the validation, and now we can click on the bottom left on create to create our resource group. And now our resource group has been created successfully. And you can see right now there is nothing really in here. You can see there are no clear services because we still need to create those. The next thing that we need to create on the Azure portal are all of the different services that we will need for our Django backend. And if we take a look at our architecture, you can see that we need an Azure App Service, which will provide us with the server, which is going to run our code. And we also need a PostgreSQL database. So let's create those next. In your Microsoft Azure portal on the top, you can search for app services. You can also see that it's already listed there. So app services like this. And we're going to click on create. And there you have a few options. You have the option of web app. You have the option of a static web app, which we're actually going to be using for the React front end. You will have WordPress on app service, but the one that we want to go for is the web app plus database. And what this configuration type is going to do is going to create our server and simultaneously also our database. And that's very convenient because it makes sure that those two can communicate with each other and set all of the different configurations already. The first things that is going to ask us is in which resource group do we want to place this app service. Now we've just created the resource group that we want to add here, so please add the resource group we just created. Next, it's again going to ask us for the region, and here goes the same thing. Please select the one closest to you. And in my case, that is still West Europe. It is also going to ask us for a web app name, and the web app name is going to be the URL where you can find your application on. And of course, later on, you will be able to buy a domain name and change your domain to the domain name. However, for now, you just need to provide the name that you want it to have. And it's going to be followed by .azurewebsites.net. So I'm just going to test a few things out to make sure that we get a unique one. And in my case, I can select Django-React-app.azurewebsites.net. And actually, I'm going to change that. I'm going to change it to Django React App Backend.azurewebsites.net. And it is also going to ask us the runtime stack of our application. And in here, you can select the version of Python that you have used during the development. And to make sure that we select the right runtime stack, we're going to go back to our code for just 1 second. So back in our code, and I want to quickly find out which version of Python that we've used during development, just to make sure. And to do that, I can simply type Python -- version. And there you can see that on my computer, I have Python version 3.8.10. So going back to our runtime stack, you can scroll down to the bottom and see that we have Python 3.8. And as you can see, it actually is the last version that is supported, so I probably need to update my version for the future. Okay, the next information that Azure requests is going to be the database. And you can already see that database access will be locked down and not exposed to the internet. So Azure is already applying some policies to make sure that it is compliant, which is quite nice. And you see already that it is selected the PostgreSQL flexible server based on our runtime stack. You can see that there are also other options, but PostgreSQL in general is the best in combination with Django. It has also already created a server name and a database name, which is just the name of our URL combined with server and database, which is completely fine with me. And it has set the cache to no, which is also fine by me. And then the hosting plan on standard. However, since this is just a tutorial, I'm going to put it on basic because this is just a hobby or research purpose, and this is not going to be a production application. All right, and I think this is actually all that we need to provide, because now Azure knows what our backend code is going to be like. It also knows the database that we are going to be using. So now we can click on Review plus Create. And over here is going to do a quick validation of all of the input that we have provided. And now we can click on Create to create all of the services that we need. And you can now see that our deployment is in progress. It can take a little bit of time before this deployment is complete. In most cases, this will take around 5 to 10 minutes. So I will be back with you once the deployment has been completed. And our deployment is now complete, and I think it took around 5 minutes in my case. So let's go to the resource and see what we find there. And to do that, I'm actually going to go to the home menu and go to our resource group that we've created. So we can see all of the different services that it has created in this case. All right, so you can see a number of new services in this container. And the two that are most important to us are going to be this one, our app service called Django React App Backend, because this is going to be where we connect our code to the Azure portal. And the next one that is also important is this one, because this is actually our Azure database for PostgreSQL. The rest of the things like the private links and the virtual network are there for security reasons and for connectivity. And the Azure Web Service over here is our app service plan. But for us, the only two things that are really important are going to be the app service and the database. And if we go into our Django React app backend, so the actual app service that we have created, we can see the things that have been created here so far. So the first thing that we notice is that our default domain is indeed Django React App Backend.Azure websites. And when we go there, it states that it is awaiting our web application content. And we will connect that shortly. In this Django React App Backend app service, there are a few things where you need to be aware of. The first thing is the deployment center on the left hand side. And the deployment center menu item is where you connect your code to your app service. So this is where we will connect our GitHub code to the Azure portal. The next important menu item to take into account is the configuration. And if we go to the configuration tab, you will see that this is a place where we can place application settings, which function as environment variables. And what you will see right here is the environment variable that has already been created by Azure, which is the Azure PostgreSQL connection string. And if you remember from the changes to our backend code in our deployment.py file, you will notice that we use this Azure PostgreSQL connection string to get the database credentials. And by using the web plus database function of app services, we have already set up that connection string from the database to our app service, which makes sure that we don't need to do any configuration between database and the server, which is quite nice for us.
So the Azure PostgreSQL connection string has already been defined by Azure, but now we're going to add another application setting on our own. Because what you might remember from our previous video in which we changed the Django settings, you know that in our deployment.py file we've defined an environment variable for the secret key called mySecretKey. But we also need to list this down inside of our application settings, otherwise it will not be recognized as an environment variable. So I'm going to copy over the name mySecretKey, and on the configuration tab under the application settings, I'm going to create a new application setting. And the name is going to be equal to mySecretKey because that needs to be the same as in our code. And for the value, we're going to take a random string from randomkeygen.com. And I'm just going to pick this one right here and paste it in as value. And of course, now this is publicly available because I'm sharing it on my screen, but please keep this as a secret for yourself. So we can click on OK, and that will add the setting right here. But beware, you still need to click on Save on the top, otherwise it will not save your setting. And let's give that some time. All right, with that additional setting being present now inside of our configuration, we're actually going to connect our code from GitHub to the Azure portal. And we are going to do that on the left tab where Deployment Center is mentioned. And when connecting our code in the Deployment Center, it is first going to ask us from the source of the code. And in there, you can see the options of Bitbucket, local Git, and Azure repos, but also GitHub. And that is the one that we're actually going to pick because that is where we pushed our code to using Git. After you select GitHub as the source, it probably is going to ask you to log into your GitHub account. However, in my case, I have done this before and it has already recognized my GitHub account based on my previous deployments. So in my case, it has already signed me in as my user. But if that's not the case, please log in with your GitHub credentials. Next, it is going to ask you to provide an organization. Well, I only have one in this case, and also the repository that you want to deploy. And in here, you select the repository that you've created in the previous video. And in my case, that is Django React deploy tutorial. It is also going to ask you for the branch that you want to deploy. And in my case, that is the main branch, and I don't have any other branches. Under the build, you can see that it specifies the runtime stack and the version. And under authentication settings, I'm going to keep it on basic authentication. And based on everything that we have put inside of this form, Azure has generated a workflow file. And we can click on preview file to see what it has created. And you can see that it has created a YAML file, and in there it has all of the different configurations for building and deploying our application. And when we save this configuration, it's going to add this file to GitHub, and then GitHub Actions is going to run this file and make sure that our application is deployed. And in this file, you can see that it has two jobs. It's first going to build our application. It's going to set up some configurations. It's going to start a virtual environment, install dependencies, and then create a zip file of our deployment. And it's going to upload that zip file for the deployment itself. And then when it actually is going to deploy it, it is going to configure a bunch of Azure stuff. And it's then going to find the file that was created for the deployment and use that to deploy the application. Now, we are going to encounter one problem when we are going to deploy our code using this workflow file. That is that it's going to look at the top level of our application when it's going to do all of these different steps. So for example, when it's going to create our virtual environment, it's just going to do that in the top layer of our GitHub repository. And the same goes for installing the dependencies and zipping up our deployment. However, if you take a look at our code, if you're going to do that in the top level folder right here, that just has the backend and the front end folder. Where it should actually do it is inside of this backend folder right here, because this is where our Django code actually lives. So what we're going to do, I'm just going to close this file and I'm going to save this. And this is going to trigger the initial deployment, which is going to fail. What we're then going to do is we're going to get that YAML file that you just saw to our local code. And then we're going to make some changes and re-trigger the deployment so everything goes the way that we expect. And Azure is now running the code based on the file that we've just seen. And you can track the run of your pipeline in GitHub Actions. So if you go to your GitHub account and then go to the repository that you created for this particular deployment, you will be able to see exactly what happens when the trigger is run. So in our code, on the top menu right here, you can select actions, and that is where you will see all of the runs of the code. And you can immediately see that we have one workload run, but it has unfortunately failed. And if we click on the failed run, you can see that we have two stages. One is build and one is deploy. And in the build stage, it has now encountered a problem. And if we go and check where that problem occurred, and you can see that it was when we installed the dependencies. And it's quite logical that that didn't run correctly, because it just does run pip install requirements.txt in the top level of our project. But there is no requirements.txt file in this top level. We first need to go to our backend, and then you will find the requirements.txt file. So we can make some changes to make sure that this will run just fine. But how do we get this code again back to our local environment? Well, you can go to your code, and in the top layer of this application, we're going to do git pull. And this is going to pull all of the changes opposed to what we have right here from GitHub and back into our code. And you can see that now a new folder has been added to our repository locally, which is the .github folder. And in there you find that YAML file that Azure has created for us to do all of the deployment stuff. And we are going to slightly change this one to make sure that it all runs correctly. Now, within each of these steps, we're just going to cd into our backend folder to make sure that all of the operations are actually done inside of this backend folder. And we're also going to add an additional command later on. So when it creates and starts a virtual environment, we're first going to cd into the backend folder, and then it can do the virtual environment stuff and activating it. That is completely fine. For installing of dependencies, we're going to do exactly the same. So we need this particular symbol right there. And then on the first line, we're going to again specify cd into the backend. And then afterwards, it can do the pip install requirements.txt. And we're actually going to add another line of code, and that is going to be python -m pip install --upgrade pip. And this is going to make sure that we use the latest version of pip to install all of the different requirements inside of our project. And this is maybe not necessarily required, but I always like to do it to make sure that we use the latest version of pip to install the packages. Okay, the next thing that we're going to do is create a zip file for the deployment. And again, here we're going to cd into our backend first, because I only want to zip up all of the folders and the files inside of our backend folder. So again, we're going to add this stand-up slash, and I'm going to cd into the backend and then go to the next line, and then it can create this nice zip file called release.zip, which will have all of the content of our backend folder. Okay, the next thing that is going to do is uploading that artifact for the deployment. So it's going to look for our zip file and upload it as an artifact so that it can later on be used by the deploy stuff to do all of the things on Azure. However, this path of release.zip is no longer correct because it will not be in our root folder, but it will be in backend/release.zip. So by making this small change, we're going to make sure that it uploads the right file to the right place. And in the deploy stage, it is going to look for the artifact, which is called Python app, which we've created right here. And it's going to get the backend/release.zip and use that for deployment. So we don't actually need to change anything in our deploy statement. We do, however, need to add another command inside of our build run, because currently we are not collecting the different static files from our Django application and putting those in the right folders. So I'm going to copy over the install dependencies step, and afterwards I'm going to have a step for collecting the static files. So we're going to collect static files, and similarly as before, we're going to cd into our backend. But then after that, we're doing the command python manage.py collect static and then --no input. And what this will do, it will collect all of the static files inside of our application, and the no input parameter specified right here is making sure that it will not ask a question whether we really want to do it yes or no. It's just going to do it regardless, because this is of course an automated script and we cannot provide user input. So to push that back to our GitHub repository and trigger the pipeline again, we can do git add git commit -am, and in there we can specify that we changed the YAML file. And when we do git push and hit enter, it's going to republish this code on GitHub, and it's going to automatically trigger the deploy to Azure from GitHub. So when we click on the Actions tab right here, you can immediately see that a new run of this pipeline has been triggered, and we can see all of the different steps that it's going to take. And you can now see that all of these steps have gone correctly. So we have installed all of the different dependencies, so you can see that it's going to install all of the packages that we have specified inside of our requirements.txt file. It has also successfully collected all of our static files, because 160 static files have been copied to our static files folder. And it has also zipped up our project and handed that over to the deploy stage. And in this deploy stage is going to actually put our code on Microsoft Azure. And I will be back with you once this full process has been completed. So a few minutes have passed by, and both our build and our deploy have now succeeded, which means that our code is now successfully connected to our Django React app backend. However, I've done this plenty of times before, and even if this full process goes well, it could be that we are still going to encounter some errors on the Azure portal. So let's take a look. Now, before we are actually going to take a look at the URL and make sure that everything is working the way that we expect, we can start by migrating our database, because I don't think we will see any useful output without all of those migrations happening correctly. So we're going to go to our app service again. And in the left-hand menu, we're going to scroll down until we see under Development Tools, the SSH tab. And SSH is going to provide us with a little bit of a console/terminal look and feel, and it's going to enable us to run database migrations. So we're going to click on Go, and it will open a console and terminal for us. All right, and this has actually fired up quite quickly, but the previous time it did not, so it could be that you need to restart this for it to work correctly. Now, all that we need to do to migrate our database is the command python manage.py migrate. And do not do the command make migrations, because you really don't need to do that. All right, and it is applying all of our migrations that are inside of our project, and this looks to be all okay. So to test whether this actually works the way that we think it should work is by creating a user. So I can do python manage.py create super user, and as the username I'm going to just say user1. As the email address I will just do user1@email.com. And as the password for now, we can just do testing321 and testing321. And our super user has now been created successfully. So this gives me a good idea that our database is at least working as we expect. So let's now check out our actual URL. So we are back again on the Azure App Service right here. And if you scroll on the left-hand side all the way to Overview, it will provide all of the details of our application, including the URL where we can find our backend. Yes, there we go. So if we click it, it will open it, and it might take some time for it to load. And you can now see, after migrating our database, that we see our API root. So everything seems to work okay. I can tell you this is quite a relief, because I've actually done this process a fair few times before I got it right. So what we can now also do is go to the /admin site and use our user1 credentials to log into our application. And in here, we're just going to create some project managers for our application, just for the sake of trying it out and seeing how this works. So if I say project manager 1, it successfully creates it, and also project manager 2. And just like that, they are inside of our database. So our backend code now seems to be deployed exactly the way that we want it. Now, the last thing that I want to add to this is a command that is going to automatically migrate the changes in our database every time the code is redeployed. Because you can imagine that I don't want to go to the SSH terminal every time we made a change to our database locally. So what I am going to do is I'm going to add a script that every time when we trigger the pipeline through the YAML file, it is going to also run that script after the build has been completed, so we don't need to migrate our database again. So in our local code, we need to add a script to our backend folder that needs to run after our deployment is complete. So I'm going to click on our backend folder right here, and I'm going to add a file, and I'm just going to call that build_script.sh. And in that script, I'm just going to do the same command that we would do in the SSH terminal, which is python manage.py migrate, like this. And of course, I want to make sure that the model is actually created after I run this deployment again. So I'm going to make a small change to our models as well. And for the sake of this video, I'm just going to create an entirely new model called test model. But if you don't want to do that, you can also just add an additional field to your existing models just to check whether it works. So I'm going to save this new model. And I'm also going to register this model in our admin.py file so that we see it in the admin portal. So I'm going to add a new line where we mention the test model so that I can see it once it is deployed. And now we actually first need to migrate our database locally, and then we can try it on the Azure portal afterwards. So I'm going to make sure that my virtual environment is on and that I'm in the backend folder, and I'm going to do python manage.py make migrations just to add that new model to the migrations files. And I'm also going to do python manage.py migrate to process that change. And now our new model has been created, and we have also added the script that is going to migrate that model. Now we need to tell Azure to actually execute this script after the deployment has been successful. And we can do that by adding an application setting to our Django backend on Azure. Right now, I'm in the Oryx configuration, and this is the engine that is deploying our application. And as you can see, there are a bunch of environment variables that you can set which trigger certain actions. And one of them is the post build script path. And in that environment variable, you can set a script that you want to run after the deployment with Oryx has been completed. And that is exactly what we're going to do. So I'm going to copy over this command. And in my configuration tab on the Microsoft Azure portal, I'm going to add a new application setting with the name of post build script path. And in here, we need to specify the path of the script that we just created. So in my case, that is build underscore script.sh. And make sure that you do not add a slash because that's not required. Doing it like this is perfect. So we're going to click OK, and then we're going to save this configuration so that the next time that this pipeline runs, it is going to also process those changes. And the last thing that we now need to do is pushing this new script to GitHub, and that will also automatically trigger the deployment again. And hopefully we will then see these model changes inside of our admin portal. So we will do git add everything, git commit -am, and then added a model. And then we can do git push. And this will redeploy our application, and hopefully this will mean that it will also add that additional model. Okay, so in GitHub Actions, I can see that the workflow has ran successfully. And if we go to our backend and to the overview page, we can click on the link and open our application again to see whether we see the model. So let's go to our domain. And it is still loading, so that's a very good sign. And if I go to the admin portal, you can see that now the new model of test models has also been migrated and successfully added to our Django admin portal. So that now also works. And that is actually all that we're going to be covering for today. In this video, we successfully deployed our Django code to Microsoft Azure. In the next video, we're going to do the same, but then with our React.js front-end code. In the last video, I will also tell you a little bit more about the costs of this deployment and also about troubleshooting, because believe me, during this process, I have done a lot of that. And I'm going to explain to you exactly how I did that so you can use that for your own. For now, I want to thank you very much for watching and following this tutorial. Please leave a like and subscribe if you like the content, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye bye.